In the blackened ruins of a forge world on the edge of the Segmentum Obscurus, a space marine walked alone. His armor bore no chapter markings, no heraldry, no proud declarations of lineage. Just worn ceramite the color of old ash, scarred by 1,000 battles, maintained with the precision of a monk and the silence of a ghost. When the inquisitorial task force found him standing over the corpses of 17 word-bearers, they demanded to know his chapter. He looked at them with eyes that had seen the Emperor walk among men, and he said nothing. Because how do you explain that you are a relic? How do you tell them that your father was erased from history itself? They are called the Forgotten, the Lost, the Expunged. 2 entire Space Marine legions, obliterated not just from the Imperium's present, but from its past. Scrubbed so thoroughly from existence that even their numbers were given to others. The Second and 11th Legions, their Primarchs nameless, their deeds unrecorded, their very existence a wound in the fabric of Imperial history that no one is permitted to touch. The Imperium has faced traitors, Xenos, and demons, but the Lost Legions represent something different. Something so terrible, so dangerous, that the Emperor himself ordered them deleted, not defeated. Not exiled, deleted. And yet, across 10,000 years of war and darkness, there are whispers, sightings, impossible encounters with warriors who should not exist. The Space Marine stood in the Hall of Remembrance aboard the battle barge Endless Vigil, the only place he ever allowed himself to truly stop. Here, in this chamber he had built with his own hands, were the things he could not forget even though the Imperium commanded it. A banner, torn and faded, bearing a symbol that would mean nothing to any living soul. A blade, forged in a style that predated the Codex Astartes. A name, carved in high Gothic on a wall that no one else would ever see. Kenjiro. It was not the name the Emperor had given him. That name was forbidden, burned away like everything else. But it was the name his sons had called him in the days before the Purge, when his legion still walked proudly in the light of Terra's sun. He called himself the Sensei now, a word from ancient Terra that meant teacher, guide, master. It was fitting. For 10 millennia, he had taught himself how to survive in an Imperium that had forgotten him, how to fight wars under false colors, how to save worlds that would never know his name, how to be a ghost in the machine of his father's crumbling empire. The Inquisition hunted ghosts. They hunted rumors of the Lost Legions with the same fervor they hunted heretics, because the truth of what happened was perhaps more dangerous than any chaos corruption. Some Inquisitors believed the Lost Legions had turned traitor before Horus. Others whispered of mutation, of genocide failure so catastrophic that it threatened the entire Astartes project. A few, the ones who dug too deep, found fragments that suggested something worse. That the Lost Legions had discovered something, learned something, seen something that could not be allowed to spread. But the Sensei knew the truth, and it was simpler and more terrible than any of their theories. His legion had not fallen to chaos. They had not mutated into monsters or turned their weapons on the Imperium. They had simply asked the wrong questions at the wrong time. His brother Primarch, the one whose name he still whispered in the darkness of his meditation chamber, had looked at the Emperor's grand design and seen its flaw. Not a crack in the edifice, but a fundamental contradiction at its heart. And when they had brought their concerns to Terra, when they had stood before their father and dared to question the path of the Great Crusade, they had been shown the price of doubt. The purge had been swift, surgical, merciless, not a battle, but an execution. The Emperor had sent Lemon Russ and his space wolves. He had sent the First Legion, the Dark Angels, shrouded in secrets of their own. Together, they had done what needed to be done. Entire companies wiped out while at parade rest. Chapter masters executed in their war rooms. The genocide stocks destroyed. Every record, every statue, every mention in every archive across 1,000,000 worlds, systematically erased by teams of Mechanicum adepts and Imperial scribes. The Sensei had survived because he was not there. He had been leading a compliance action 3 systems away when the killing began. By the time he received word, by the time he understood what was happening, it was already over. His legion was gone. His Primarch was dead, though even the manner of that death was sealed under so many layers of classification that it might as well have never happened. And the message that reached him was clear. Return to Terra and join your brothers in oblivion, or disappear so completely that you might as well have never existed. He chose the third option. He chose to become something the Emperor had not anticipated. A witness, a memory, a living reminder that even gods could fail their sons. For 10,000 years, he had moved through the Imperium like a shadow. Sometimes he wore the colors of the Ultramarines, fighting in campaigns where his veteran expertise made the difference between victory and annihilation. Sometimes he claimed to be a Black Shield, a Death Watch outcast, selling his skills to inquisitors who never looked too closely at his ancient war gear. Once, for 3 centuries, he had even served with the Blood Ravens, a chapter that asked fewer questions than most, perhaps because they had their own secrets to keep. He never stayed long, never left enough of a trail for the Inquisition to follow, never formed bonds that might lead to dangerous curiosity about his past. He was the eternal stranger, the wandering master, appearing where the fighting was hardest and vanishing before the victory celebrations began. But the galaxy was changing. The Great Rift had torn reality itself in half. Primarchs were returning from death and disappearance, striding back onto the stage of history like characters in an ancient tragedy coming back for the final act. And with their return came questions. Questions about lineage, about the lost days of the Imperium, about the gaps in the records that no one was supposed to notice. The Sensei felt it in his bones, that premonition that came with 13,000 years of survival instincts. The time of hiding was ending. The Imperium, fragmenting under the weight of its own mythology, was starting to remember what it had been commanded to forget. And he was not the only one. His intelligence network, cultivated over millennia, brought him rumors from across the galaxy. A battle barge with no recorded origin, appearing from the Ghoul stars to save a cardinal world from a tyrannid invasion before jumping back into the warp. A squad of giants in unmarked armor, fighting alongside the Imperial Guard on Vigilus, whose tactical doctrine matched nothing in the Codex Astartes. A voice, speaking ancient Colchisian over Vox channels during the Plague Wars, giving orders that Guilliman himself could not countermand because the speaker knew encryption codes that predated the Heresy. The Lost Legions were stirring, not as armies, not as organized forces, but as individuals, survivors, outcasts, the forgotten children of a forgotten time, stepping back into a galaxy that had left no place for them. The Sensei stood before the viewing port of his ship, watching the stars wheel past in the madness of warp travel. Somewhere out there, his brothers were waking up. The question was simple and terrible. When the Imperium finally remembered what it had tried so hard to forget, would it welcome its lost sons home, or would it try to kill them all over again? The Mechanicum facility on Jawa Arcade had been abandoned for 6,000 years. Its forges cold, its manufacturums silent, its Tet priests long dead from a malady the records called simply data corruption. But the Sensei knew better. He had been here before, in the dying days of the Great Crusade, when this world was still called by its first name, when its forges had burned bright with the work of creating weapons for a war that was supposed to unite the galaxy. He remembered the Archmagos who had overseen the facility, a woman named Xanthia 9, who had asked too many questions about Geneseed compatibility across different Legion stock. He remembered the day the orders came down from Mars, sealed with the sigil of the Fabricator General himself. Discontinue all research. Purge all data. The facility would be repurposed. Xanthia 9 was never seen again. The Sensei's boots echoed through corridors that had not heard footsteps in millennia. His armor's sensors painted the darkness in thermal green, revealing walls lined with empty cogitator banks and archive chambers that had been systematically gutted. But he was not here for what remained. He was here for what they had missed. Every purge, no matter how thorough, left traces. The Mechanicum had a saying, "Data is never truly deleted, only overwritten." And if you knew where to look, if you understood the architecture of early Mechanicum storage systems, you could find the ghosts in the machine. The sub-basement vault required 3 different cipher keys to access, each one drawn from his memory of security protocols that predated the current Mechanicum hierarchy by 10,000 years. The door, massive and corroded, groaned open with a sound like a dying giant. Inside, preserved in stasis fields that still hummed with faint power, were data cores, hundreds of them. Archive cylinders from the early days of the Imperium, when record-keeping was done in triplicate, when redundancy was built into every system because the Mechanicum understood that knowledge was more precious than gold. He connected his armor systems to the first core and felt the rush of data flooding into his neural interface. Personnel records, Legion rosters, Genocide compatibility matrices. And there, buried beneath layers of encryption and false file headers, the things they had tried to erase. The Second Legion. The 11th Legion. Not just names now, but faces, his brothers. Marines he had fought beside, trained with, bled alongside in the burning sands of Terra's conquest. Tokuga Wu, his first company captain, whose skill with a blade had been legendary even among Astartes. Musashi, the champion who had never lost a duel, who could read an opponent's intent before they moved. Yamamoto, the fleet master whose tactical genius had broken the back of 3 Xenos empires. All dead now, all erased. But here, in this forgotten vault on this dead world, they lived again in streams of data and archived memory. The sensei felt something crack in his chest, a sensation he had not allowed himself to feel in 10 millennia. Grief, not the sharp pain of fresh loss, but the deep, ancient ache of wounds that had never properly healed, because there had been no time to mourn, no permission to remember. He pulled more data. Battle reports from campaigns that officially never happened. Compliance records from worlds whose conquest was now attributed to other legions. Communications logs that showed his Primarchs growing unease with the Emperor's methods. The questions that became concerns. The concerns that became objections. And then, the final entries. The ones that explained everything. His Primarch had discovered something during the conquest of a world in the Ghoul Stars. A human civilization that had survived Old Night intact, that possessed technology and knowledge rivaling anything Terra had produced. But it was not their technology that had troubled his gene father. It was their history. They had records, ancient and fragmented, of a previous human empire that had spanned the galaxy. An empire that had fallen not to Xenos or to warp storms, but to something else, to its own ambition, to the same kind of godhood the Emperor was building toward. The reports were fragmentary, corrupted by age and deliberate damage, but the implication was clear. His Primarch had brought evidence to Terra, evidence that the Imperial truth might be a lie, evidence that the Emperor's plan might lead humanity down the same path that had destroyed it before. The response had been immediate and total. The sensei closed his eyes, not needing to read further. He knew what came next: the sanction, the purge, the erasure. His father had built the Imperium on a foundation of certainty, of absolute conviction that his way was the only way. And when one of his sons had dared to present evidence otherwise, when one of his generals had suggested that perhaps there was a flaw in the grand design, the Emperor had done what he always did with threats to his vision. He had eliminated them. Not out of cruelty, the sensei had come to understand over the long millennia, but out of something worse, out of necessity. Because if the Emperor admitted doubt, if he allowed the possibility that his plan might fail, then everything would unravel. The Imperium required faith, even from those who knew the Imperial truth, denied the existence of gods. A sound shattered his reverie. Motion sensors pinged. He was not alone. The sensei's hand moved to his blade with the reflexive speed of 13,000 years of combat. He turned, ready for anything: Inquisition, Dark Mechanicum, Chaos Warband. But what emerged from the shadows was none of these things. It was another Space Marine, unmarked armor like his own, ancient warplate maintained with obsessive care, and a face he recognized, though it had been 10,000 years since he had seen it. The other Marine stopped at the edge of the light, his own hand on his weapon, his posture radiating the same lethal readiness. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, two ghosts from a deleted history, meeting in the tomb of their past. 11th Legion, the stranger said finally, his voice hoarse from disuse or emotion. 3rd Company. I thought I was the last. The Sensei felt something shift in his chest. 2nd Legion, he replied. 1st Company. I thought the same. The other Marine stepped forward, and in the dim light, the Sensei could see the weight he carried. The same burden of memory and survival and endless, grinding solitude. How many of us are left? The stranger asked. How many still walk? The Sensei accessed the intelligence network he had spent millennia building, cross-referencing sightings and rumors and impossible encounters. I have tracked 17 confirmed contacts, he said slowly. Possibly twice that number in unconfirmed reports. Scattered across the galaxy. Hiding, fighting, surviving. Some alone, like us. Some integrated into other chapters, living under false identities. All of us forbidden to speak our true names. The other Marine nodded slowly. I have found 12, he said. I thought about gathering them, creating something. A chapter in all but name. But the risk ... He did not need to finish. They both understood. The moment the Lost Legions became organized, became a threat rather than scattered individuals, the Imperium would mobilize to destroy them again. It was the oldest survival strategy of the hunted. Never gather, never form a pattern, never give your hunters a target they can see. But the galaxy was changing, and scattered individuals would not survive what was coming. The Great Rift had rewritten the rules of reality. Primarchs were returning. Chaos was ascendant. The Imperium was fragmenting into 1,000 desperate struggles for survival. And in that chaos, in that fragmentation, there might be something the Lost Legions had never had before. An opportunity. The Indomitus Crusade, the Sensei said, thinking aloud. Robot Guilliman is creating new chapters, integrating Primarchs reinforcements, restructuring the entire Astartes organization. In that confusion, in that massive reorganization, ... the other Marine's eyes widened with understanding. We could resurface, not as our old legions, but as new chapters. Veterans from lost campaigns, Black Shields seeking redemption, scattered survivors of destroyed homeworlds. Guilliman is too pragmatic to waste experienced Astartes, even if their origins are questionable. It was dangerous. It was perhaps the most dangerous thing they could attempt. But for the first time in 10,000 years, the Sensei felt something he had almost forgotten. Hope. Not hope for redemption, or for the Imperium to acknowledge what it had done, but hope that perhaps the Emperor's lost children might finally step out of the shadows and fight openly for the Imperium they had helped build, even if they had to do it under new names and false colors. The stranger extended his hand, a gesture from ancient Terra, from before the Imperium, from the days when warriors made pacts and alliances with nothing but their word and their honor. I am called Takeda now, he said. Whatever my true name was, it died with my legion. The Sensei gripped his hand, feeling the strength in it, the certainty of a warrior who had survived the impossible. I am called Sensei, he replied. And I think it is time we stopped hiding. As they stood there in the ruins of the Mechanicum facility, surrounded by the archived ghosts of their dead brothers, a plan began to form, not a rebellion. Not a resurrection of the Lost Legions, but something more subtle, a network. A hidden brotherhood of the forgotten, working within the Imperium's chaos to guide it, protect it, serve the father who had erased them. They would be the unseen hand in a dozen campaigns. The unexpected reinforcements arriving at the perfect moment. The veterans whose advice turned defeats into victories. The masters teaching new generations of Astartes the old ways, the tactics and wisdom from before the Codex, from the days when the Emperor himself walked among his warriors. And somewhere the sensei knew, his father watched. The Emperor, entombed on the golden throne, psychic might stretched across the galaxy. Did he know his lost son still served? Did he feel their presence in the warp, fighting his battles under borrowed names? Or had he truly forgotten them, erased them so completely from his mind that even his vast consciousness could not recall what he had destroyed? The answer, the sensei realized, did not matter anymore. They would serve anyway, because that was what they were made for. Not for glory or recognition or a place in history, but for this. For the endless, thankless work of keeping humanity alive in a galaxy that wanted to devour it. They were the forgotten children, and they would make sure their father's dream survived, even if he never remembered their names. 3 months after the meeting on WARHAMMER, the sensei stood in the stratagem of a ship that did not officially exist, watching hololithic projections of 17 different war zones simultaneously. Each one showed the telltale signs of their intervention. Here, on Sanctus Reach, a company of Black Shields had reinforced the Imperial line at the exact moment the Orc breakthrough would have collapsed the entire defense. There, in the Chalnoth expanse, a mysterious fleet had translated from the warp to evacuate a threatened Forge world, their tactics displaying a sophistication that belonged to another age. And on Vigilus, eyewitness reports spoke of giants in ash-gray armor fighting alongside the Ultramarines, warriors who moved with a discipline and coordination that spoke of training older than the Codex Astartes itself. The network was growing. Takeda had proven as skilled at organization as the sensei had hoped, reaching out to survivors through channels so subtle that even the Inquisition's vast surveillance apparatus could not trace them. 17 confirmed contacts had become 32. 32 had become 58. Each one a veteran of impossible age, a master of their craft, a warrior who had spent 10,000 years learning not just how to fight, but how to survive, how to adapt, how to be useful in a galaxy that denied their existence. But success brought danger. The more visible they became, even under false identities, the more attention they attracted. And the Inquisition was not the only force hunting for anomalies in the Imperium's vast machinery. The sensei cycled through intelligence reports with growing unease. A Grey Knight strike force had interrogated survivors on Sanctus Reach, asking pointed questions about the Black Shield's origins and why their fighting style resembled pre-Heresy tactical doctrine. On Chalnoth, tech priests had attempted to analyze the wreckage of one of the mysterious fleet's ships, finding equipment patterns and forge marks that predated any known manufacturing schema in their archives. Worse still, there were whispers from inside the Dark Angels. That secretive First Legion, whose own history was a labyrinth of hidden shamas and buried truths, had begun deploying interrogator chaplains to worlds where the lost had appeared. The Dark Angels knew something. They had been there at the Purge, had participated in the erasure, and perhaps they remembered what they had been ordered to forget. The sensei understood the Dark Angels better than most. They were not hunting out of malice, but out of fear. Fear that old secrets might surface. Fear that the careful structures of lies and misdirection they had built around their own past might crumble if other hidden truths came to light. The Imperium was not a monolith, but a collection of factions held together by mutual necessity and mutual deception, each one harboring secrets they would kill to protect. The Vox crackled. Takeda's voice, tense with controlled urgency. "We have a problem." The Martian delegation. The sensei's hands tightened on the edge of the hololithic table. The Martian delegation was supposed to be routine. A group of survivors from the 11th had intercepted a Mechanicum research vessel that had stumbled upon pre-Heresy archaeotech in the Halo stars. Standard protocol: make contact, offer protection, ensure the tech did not fall into chaos hands. But something had gone wrong. "They took prisoners," Takeda continued. 3 Mechanicum adepts. "They're demanding to see the ranking officer. They say they have questions about equipment serial numbers that don't match any known Forge world." The sensei felt ice crystallize in his veins. Serial numbers. The Mechanicum never forgot a Forge mark, never lost track of a production run. If they had found equipment that predated the official records, equipment from legions that were supposed to never have existed, they would trace it back. They would ask questions. They would investigate. An investigation led to discovery. Discovery led to exposure. Exposure led to termination. Bring them here, the sensei said quietly. And bring our brothers as well. All of them. The chamber fell silent except for the hum of systems and the distant throb of the ship's plasma drives. A decision point. They could kill the Mechanicum adepts, bury the evidence, scatter again into the shadows. Or they could do something far more dangerous. They could tell the truth. 6 hours later, the 3 tech priests stood in the stratageum, their mechadendrites twitching with agitation, their optic sensors recording everything. Around them, in a loose circle, stood 23 Space Marines in unmarked armor. Warriors from 2 different legions from bloodlines that were supposed to be extinct. The oldest living Astartes in the galaxy, save perhaps the few remaining dreadnoughts who slept in the deepest vaults of the oldest chapters. The lead tech priest, a woman whose designation was Sigma 7 Rho, spoke with the artificial calm of one whose emotion suppressors were working overtime. Your equipment, the fusion cores in your armor, the manufacturing signatures date to M30, before the Heresy, before the Codex reforms, before 90% of current Mechanicum production protocols even existed. The sensei stepped forward, removing his helmet. Let them see his face. Let them see the age in his eyes, the weight of centuries that no amount of genetic enhancement could fully hide. We are the Second and 11th Legions, he said simply. The forgotten, the expunged. We have been walking among you for 10,000 years, serving an Imperium that tried to kill us, fighting for a father who erased our names from history. The tech priest's optics flickered, processing. Sigma 7 Rho's mechadendrites went utterly still, a sign of extreme cognitive strain as she accessed her deepest memory banks, cross-referencing forbidden data. The Lost Legions, she whispered, and there was something almost like awe in her synthesized voice. The gaps in the production records. The unaccounted genocide tithes in the early Crusade data. The archived forge orders that reference Legion designations that do not exist in current databases. We thought it was data corruption. We thought it was archival errors from the Age of Strife backups. It was intentional, Takeda said, his voice hard. Your fabricator general received orders from the Emperor himself. Delete, purge, erase, every record, every schematic, every mention. Make it as though we never were. Sigma 7 Rho processed this. Her emotion suppressors were losing their battle against something primal in her augmented consciousness. But why? What sin warranted such complete erasure? Even the traitor legions remain in the records, archived as examples of what must be opposed. But you were deleted. What could be worse than treason? The sensei looked at her, this representative of Mars, this servant of the machine god, and made a choice. He reached into his armor's memory core and extracted a data wafer, holding it out. This is what we found, what my Primarch discovered. The reason we were killed. Read it. Then decide if you will help us or condemn us. Sigma 7 Rho took the wafer with trembling mechadendrites. The data flowed into her consciousness, and the sensei watched as her optics widened, as her processing system struggled with information that contradicted everything the Mechanicum believed. It was the data from Zhao Arkad, refined and verified. Evidence of a previous human empire, one that had reached heights Terra was only beginning to approach. Evidence of godhood attempted and achieved. Evidence of that godhood's price, written in the extinction of a trillion souls. And evidence that the Emperor knew, had always known, was walking the same path anyway, convinced his will was strong enough to succeed where others had failed. This is, Sigma 7 Rho paused, searching for words adequate to the revelation. This is fundamental. This changes the calculus of the quest for knowledge. This suggests the Omnissiah's plan might be ... She could not finish, could not speak the heresy aloud. But the sensei saw understanding in her optics. understanding of why such information could not be allowed to spread. Why those who had learned it were erased rather than simply silenced. Because knowledge like this was a virus. Once you saw it, you could not unsee it. Once you understood the implications, every certainty became a question. Every truth became suspect. The Emperor destroyed us to protect his vision, the Sensei said softly. Not because we were wrong, but because we might have been right. And if we were right, then everything he was building was doomed to fail. Better to kill us than to admit doubt. Better to erase us than to acknowledge that his grand plan might lead humanity to the same extinction that had claimed it before. The stratagem was silent except for the background hum of systems. The other lost stood motionless, watching. They had all grappled with this truth over the millennia, had each come to their own accommodation with serving a father who had tried to kill them. But speaking it aloud, giving voice to the forbidden knowledge, was something else entirely. It made it real in a way that private understanding never could. Sigma 7 Rho stood frozen, processing. Her fellow adepts were similarly locked in cognitive loops, their belief systems warring with the evidence their sensors could not deny. Finally, the senior tech priest spoke, and her voice carried a weight that suggested she was accessing subroutines she had kept hidden even from herself. "The Fabricator General," she said slowly, "has a sealed vault beneath the Noctis Labyrinthus. It is never opened, never accessed, never spoken of. But in the oldest, most encrypted Mechanicum protocols, it has a designation. The Chamber of Forgotten Things." The Sensei felt something click into place. "You mean Mars knows, has always known, not knows," Sigma 7 Rho corrected. "Suspects, archives. The Mechanicum does not delete data, even when ordered to. We obfuscate, we encrypt, we hide. But we do not destroy knowledge. It is against our fundamental programming." So when the order came down to purge all records of the Second and 11th Legions, the Fabricator General complied, and simultaneously created a backup. Locked it away where even he could not easily access it. Insurance, perhaps. Or simply the inability to truly destroy information, even when commanded by the Omnissiah himself. The implications cascaded through the Sensei's mind. Mars had preserved evidence of the lost legions, had kept their secrets in a vault so deep and so sealed that 10,000 years had passed without anyone accessing it. But now, with Primarchs returning, with the Imperium fragmenting, with the old certainties crumbling under the weight of the galaxy's new realities, that vault might be open. And if it were open, if Mars revealed what it had hidden, it could change everything. "What will you do?" Takeda asked the tech priests. "You know what we are now. You know we exist. Will you report us to the Inquisition, to the High Lords? Will you call for our destruction, as your predecessors did 10,000 years ago?" Sigma 7 Rho's optics flickered through a spectrum of colors as she processed probabilities, outcomes, theological implications, practical considerations. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a certainty that transcended her augmentations. "The Omnissiah created you for a purpose. That you still exist after 10 millennia of persecution suggests that purpose is not yet fulfilled. The Mechanicum serves the quest for knowledge and the preservation of technology. You are technology, living, breathing archaeotech from the founding of the Imperium. To destroy you would be to destroy irreplaceable data. This is unacceptable." She looked around at the assembled warriors, her sensors cataloging details, recording biometrics, analyzing armor configurations that had not been seen in 10,000 years. "But you cannot continue as you have been. The attention you are drawing is unsustainable. The Inquisition will find you. The Dark Angels will find you. And when they do, they will bring force sufficient to destroy you completely this time." The Sensei nodded slowly. He had known this moment would come. The moment when hiding became impossible, when they would have to choose between extinction and revelation. "So what do you propose?" The tech priest's mechadendrites moved in a pattern that might have been the Mechanicum equivalent of a smile. "I propose we make you legitimate. The Imperium is creating new chapters. Reboot Guilliman is rebuilding the Astartes with Primarchs technology, integrating new bloodlines, accepting warriors from questionable origins because he needs every weapon he can find. Mars controls the genocide tithes. Mars certifies the genetic purity. Mars grants the approval for new chapter foundings. She paused, letting the implications settle. If Mars were to discover that certain Black Shield companies were actually survivors from the Ultima, founding whose records were lost in a warp translation incident, who would question it? If Mars were to certify that their genocide, while of unusual provenance, showed no signs of corruption or mutation, who would contradict the Fabricator General himself? It was audacious. It was dangerous. It was perhaps the only path forward that did not end in their complete destruction. But it required something the Sensei had never seriously contemplated. It required them to stop being ghosts and become real again. To have a name, a homeworld, a place in the official order of battle. To be visible. The Sensei looked around at his brothers, these survivors of the impossible, these forgotten children who had fought for 10,000 years without recognition or reward. He saw the hunger in their eyes, the desperate need to step out of the shadows, to fight openly, to be acknowledged as the Emperor's sons, even if that acknowledgement came under false pretenses. But he also saw the fear, because visibility meant vulnerability, meant scrutiny, meant that the Inquisition could find them, study them, eventually unravel the lie. And when that happened, when the truth finally emerged, there would be a reckoning that would make the original purge look like mercy. Yet what choice did they have? The galaxy was burning. Humanity was dying by degrees, assailed on all fronts by horrors that grew stronger with each passing year. They could hide and watch it fall, or they could step forward and fight, even knowing it might be the death of them. Even knowing that serving their father might ultimately require the sacrifice he had demanded 10,000 years ago. The sacrifice of their existence, their identity, their right to be remembered. The Sensei made his decision, and with it, set in motion events that would ripple across the Imperium in ways none of them could yet predict. He extended his hand to Sigma 7 Rho, a gesture of alliance from a time before the Mechanicum's current protocols existed. "Then let us begin," he said. "Create us. Give us a name. Make us legitimate. And we will show the Imperium what the lost legions could have been if we had been allowed to live." As their hands met, human flesh to augmented steel, the Sensei felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders once more. They were stepping into the light after 10 millennia of darkness. And somewhere, in the Immaterium's twisted currents, he felt his father's attention shift. The Emperor knew. Had always known his lost sons still lived. And now, perhaps, he was finally ready to acknowledge what he had tried so hard to destroy. The fortress monastery rose from the dead world's surface like an accusation against the void. It had been built in secret over 6 standard months, constructed by Mechanicum servitors whose memory cores were wiped immediately after completion, on a planet whose coordinates were known only to 3 individuals in the entire Imperium. The world had no name in current Imperial records, only a numerical designation that meant nothing to anyone who might stumble across it. But the Sensei knew its true name, the one it had carried in the days before the Purge. Katsura, the place where his legion had first mustered after their Primarchs' discovery, where young warriors from Terra had met their gene father for the first time and learned what it meant to be his sons. That the Mechanicum had agreed to build here, on this specific world, was Sigma 7 Rho's acknowledgement of something deeper than mere pragmatism. It was a gesture of respect, perhaps even of atonement, for Mars's role in the original erasure. The chapter would be called the Void Wardens, their heraldry a broken chain against a field of ash gray, their fortress monastery designated as monitoring station for a region of space so worthless that no one would question why a full chapter needed to be stationed there. Their genocide would be listed as Ultima founding stock, derivative of Guilliman's line, but with genetic drift, attributed to warp exposure during their supposed lost voyage. The fiction was elaborate, detailed, supported by falsified records, that Sigma 7 Rho had woven through the Mechanicum archives with a skill that spoke of long practice in such deceptions. Within 2 weeks of the fortress monastery's completion, the first official communication arrived. Not from the Inquisition, as the Sensei had feared, but from Guilliman's own fleet. The Lord Commander of the Imperium wished to inspect this new chapter personally to assess their readiness and their loyalty. It was, the message noted with bureaucratic precision, standard procedure for all Ultima founding chapters, but the Sensei knew better. Roboute Guilliman had not survived 10,000 years in stasis and returned to lead a dying Imperium by being careless. He would come looking for irregularities, for signs of corruption or heresy, or whatever secrets the Void Wardens might be hiding. And the Primarch of the Ultramarines had fought beside the Lost Legions during the Great Crusade. He had trained with them, bled with them, knew their tactics and their temperaments. Would he recognize them? Could 10,000 years of experience and adaptation hide what they truly were from a being who had known them before the fall? The Sensei stood in the chapter's great hall, surrounded by 97 warriors drawn from both Lost Legions, wearing the ash-gray armor of their new identity. Each one had been selected for their ability to adapt, to play a role, to be someone other than what they were. They were veterans of countless false identities, masters of the art of camouflage that went deeper than any chameleoline cloak. But this was different. This was not infiltrating an existing chapter or posing as a black shield for a single campaign. This was claiming to be something they were not, permanently, publicly, under the scrutiny of a Primarch who might see through them with a single glance. "He will know," Takeda said quietly, standing at the Sensei's right hand. "Perhaps not immediately, but eventually. Guilliman is thorough, patient. He will observe us, study our methods, and sooner or later he will recognize something. A tactical doctrine we should not know. A ritual we should not practice. A word in a language that predates the Codex." The Sensei did not disagree. But he also understood something about Roboute Guilliman that perhaps even the Primarch did not fully acknowledge about himself. The Lord Commander was a pragmatist above all else. He lived in a galaxy where purity of origin mattered less than effectiveness in battle, where the Imperium was so desperate for loyal warriors that even the dubious were welcome if they could hold a line. If Guilliman discovered what they truly were, the question would not be whether to destroy them, but whether they were useful enough to preserve despite their origins. The calculus would be cold, practical, and ultimately based on a single factor. Could the Void Warden serve the Imperium better than they threatened it? The Sensei intended to ensure the answer was yes. The Macrag's honor translated from the warp with the precision that characterized everything Guilliman commanded. The fleet that accompanied it was modest by Crusade standards, but overwhelming by any other measure. 3 battle barges, a dozen strike cruisers, and escorts sufficient to level a continent. This was not just an inspection. This was a show of force, a reminder that the Lord Commander's approval was not optional. The Sensei stood on the Fortress Monastery's landing platform as the Primarch's Thunderhawk descended, feeling the weight of 13,000 years pressing down on him. He had stood on platforms like this before, waiting for Primarchs to arrive. He had met 6 of them during the Great Crusade, had fought alongside 4, had watched 2 of them descend into the madness that would become the Heresy. And he had stood on a platform very much like this one, when Lemon Russ had arrived with the Emperor's sanction, when the killing had begun and his legion had died. The ramp lowered with a hiss of hydraulics. Roboute Guilliman emerged, resplendent in the armor of fate, the Emperor's sword at his hip radiating a light that made the Sensei's enhanced vision ache. Behind him came a retinue of Ultramarines, Victrix Guard in their bone-white armor, and several figures in inquisitorial regalia whose presence sent cold warnings through every survival instinct the Sensei possessed. The Primarch's eyes swept across the assembled Void Wardens with the analytical precision of a being designed to process information faster than baseline humans could think. Those eyes lingered on the Sensei, and for a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, the 2 warriors studied each other across the platform. Then Guilliman smiled, expression that carried warmth but also calculation. "Chapter Master," he said, his voice carrying the authority of genetic superiority and 10 millennia of legend. "I am pleased to see the reports of your chapter's founding were not exaggerated. Your fortress is well constructed, your warriors disciplined. Mars speaks highly of your potential." The Sensei bowed, the gesture precise and correct according to current protocol. "Lord Commander, the Void Wardens are honored by your presence. We stand ready to serve the Imperium in whatever capacity you require." They moved through the fortress in a formal procession, Guilliman examining everything with the thoroughness that had made him a legend even among Primarchs. He inspected the armory, noting the maintenance of weapons. He reviewed the training chambers, watching the Void Wardens spar with an intensity that suggested he was cataloging their techniques. He examined the chapter's Genocide vaults, listening as Sigma 7 Rho explained the genetic lineage with a technical precision that bordered on religious fervor. And through it all, the Sensei felt the Primarch's attention returning to him, like a targeting reticle that never quite locked but never quite moved away. They stood alone finally in the chapter's strategium, the Primarch having dismissed his retinue with a gesture that permitted no argument. Just two Astartes, separated by genetic legacy and 10,000 years of divergent history, studying hololithic displays of the surrounding void. "Your tactical arrangements are sound," Guilliman said, not looking at the Sensei but at the displays. "Your defensive positions show a sophistication beyond what I would expect from a newly founded chapter. Your supply lines are redundant in ways that suggest experience with long campaigns in hostile territory. Your communication protocols include encryption methods that predate the current Mechanicum standard by several thousand years." The Sensei felt his twin hearts accelerate, pumping gene-enhanced blood through a body that was preparing for fight or flight. But he kept his voice level, his posture relaxed. "We were fortunate in our training cadre, Lord Commander. Veterans from multiple chapters, each bringing their own expertise." Guilliman finally turned to look at him, and in those eyes the Sensei saw something that chilled him more than any threat could. Understanding. Not certainty, but suspicion so strong it might as well be knowledge. "I fought in the Great Crusade," the Primarch said quietly. "I knew all 20 of my brothers. I trained with their legions. I learned their methods, their philosophies, their approaches to warfare. Each legion had its own character, its own identity. The Ultramarines valued structure and flexibility. The Imperial fists built impregnable defenses. The White Scars struck like lightning. And the Second Legion ... double quote. And the Sensei realized with horrible clarity that Guilliman remembered. Despite the purge, despite the erasure, despite 10,000 years of enforced forgetting, the Primarch remembered the lost legions. "The Second Legion fought like water," Guilliman continued, his voice taking on a quality of distant recollection. "Flowing around obstacles, adapting to any terrain, turning enemy strength into weakness through precision and patience. Their chapter master was a warrior philosopher who believed that the greatest victories were won before battle was joined, through understanding of self and enemy so complete that conflict became merely the execution of an inevitable conclusion." The Sensei stood very still, knowing that any response might confirm what Guilliman was clearly considering. The Primarch studied him with eyes that had commanded legions, that had built an empire spanning half a galaxy, that had looked upon the Emperor himself and debated philosophy and strategy as one immortal to another. "Tell me, Chapter Master," Guilliman said softly, dangerously. "How old are you?" "Truly?" The question hung in the air like a blade. The Sensei calculated responses, probabilities, outcomes. Lie and risk the insult to Guilliman's intelligence. Tell the truth and risk everything they had built. Deflect and confirm the Primarch's suspicions through evasion. In the end, he chose a middle path, one that honored both truth and necessity. "Old enough to remember when the Imperium was young," he said carefully. "Old enough to have fought in wars that are no longer recorded in the archives. Old enough to know that service to the Emperor transcends identity transcends recognition, transcends even the right to be remembered. Guilliman's expression shifted through several configurations, too fast for even enhanced senses to catalog fully. Surprise, realization, something that might have been grief, and finally, a kind of resigned acceptance. The lost legions, the Primarch breathed, and hearing those words spoken aloud by one who had known them, who had commanded alongside them, was like a wound opening after 10,000 years of scar tissue. You survived. How many? Enough, the Sensei replied. Scattered across the galaxy, serving under false names, fighting the Emperor's wars without recognition or reward. We have been here all along, Lord Commander. Ghosts in the machine of your father's Imperium. The forgotten children who refused to die. The Primarch moved to the Strategian's viewing port, looking out at the void beyond. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that spoke of decisions being made, of paths being chosen that could not be unchosen. I should report this. Should inform the High Lords, the Inquisition. Should have you examined, interrogated, tested for corruption or taint. The protocols are clear. The lost legions were expunged for reasons so severe that even now, 10 millennia later, those reasons remain sealed under the highest possible classification. He turned back, and the Sensei saw in his face the terrible burden of command that came with being a Primarch in an Imperium that had forgotten why such beings were created. But the protocols were written for an Imperium that had the luxury of purity, for an age when we could afford to discard weapons because their origins were questionable. That Imperium is dead. Has been dead since the moment Horus turned traitor and half my brothers fell to chaos. We live now in an empire of compromises, of desperate alliances, of utilizing every resource available no matter how dubious its provenance. Guilliman moved closer, and the Sensei understood that what happened next would determine not just his fate, but the fate of every survivor of the lost legions. You will serve, the Primarch said, his voice carrying absolute authority. You will be the Void Wardens, and you will fight for the Imperium with every weapon at your disposal. You will be loyal, effective, and utterly beyond reproach in your conduct. And in return, I will ensure that certain questions are never asked, certain investigations never opened, certain suspicions never confirmed. It was not forgiveness. It was not acceptance. It was a transaction, cold and practical, between a Primarch who needed warriors and warriors who needed legitimacy. But it was also something more. It was acknowledgement, after 10,000 years of erasure, that they existed, that they mattered, that their service meant something, even if their names could never be spoken. The Sensei bowed deeper this time, a gesture of genuine respect and gratitude. We will not fail you, Lord Commander. We have waited 10,000 years for this moment. We will prove ourselves worthy of the Emperor's trust, even if we must do so wearing another legion's colors. Guilliman nodded slowly, then did something unexpected. He reached out and placed his hand on the Sensei's shoulder, a gesture of brotherhood that transcended rank and protocol. I am sorry, the Primarch said quietly, for what was done to you, for what my father ordered, for the 10,000 years you have spent as ghosts. It was unjust. But justice is a luxury we can no longer afford. Survival is all that remains. And if the lost legions can help ensure that survival, then perhaps their sacrifice was not entirely meaningless. As the Primarch left, returning to his fleet and his endless crusade to save a dying Imperium, the Sensei stood alone in the Strategium and felt something shift in his chest. Not quite hope, but close. A sense that perhaps finally the long exile was ending. That the Emperor's forgotten children might at last step out of the shadows and fight openly under the stars they had helped conquer so long ago. But in the depths of his enhanced mind, where instincts honed by 13,000 years of survival whispered their warnings, he knew this was only the beginning. Guilliman's acceptance meant visibility. Visibility meant scrutiny. And scrutiny, eventually, would lead someone to ask the question that could not be answered without unraveling everything. What had the lost legions done to warrant such complete erasure? What knowledge had they possessed that was so dangerous the Emperor himself had ordered them destroyed? The summons came 3 months after Guilliman's inspection, delivered not through official channels but through a coded transmission that only the Sensei's encryption systems could decipher. The coordinates led to a system marked as quarantined, a dead zone in Imperial space where fleets were forbidden to travel, and even astropathic communication was blocked by ancient edict. The message itself was unsigned, but the signature encryption was unmistakable. It came from the Dark Angels. The Sensei stood before his assembled command council, warriors from both lost legions who had earned their place through centuries of proven loyalty and tactical acumen. Takeda was there, and Musashi, whose name he had reclaimed after Guilliman's tacit approval. Yamamoto commanded the Void assets. Tokugawa led the first company. Others whose names had been lost, but whose faces carried the weight of ages beyond counting. "It is a trap," Tokugawa said flatly. "The Dark Angels have hunted us since the beginning. They were there at the Purge. They know what we are. This summons is an execution disguised as a meeting." But the Sensei was not certain. The Dark Angels were hunters, yes, but they were also keepers of secrets so profound that their entire chapter structure revolved around concealment and control of information. If they wanted the Void Wardens dead, they would have struck already, silently, completely. A formal summon suggested something else. Something that required conversation rather than violence. "We go," the Sensei decided. "Not the entire chapter, a single ship, myself and an honor guard. If it is a trap, the chapter survives. If it is something else ... double quotes he did not finish, because he did not know what else it could be. But his instincts, honed across millennia of impossible survival, told him this moment was significant in ways he could not yet perceive. The system they translated into was dead in every sense that mattered. 3 planets orbited a dying star, their surfaces scoured clean by some ancient catastrophe. Debris fields suggested void battles of unimaginable scale, wreckage so old that even the Mechanicum could not date it accurately. And in the shadow of the 3rd planet, a fleet waited. Not just Dark Angels, the Sensei realized as his sensors compiled the data, but others. A Grey Knight strike cruiser, its presence a stark warning that the Inquisition's demon hunters were involved. A ship bearing the heraldry of the Custodian Guard, the Emperor's own Praetorians, whose involvement suggested this matter reached to the highest echelons of Imperial authority. And at the center, a vessel unlike any other. Ancient, its design predating even the Great Crusade's earliest expeditions. A ship that should not exist, bearing marks that suggested had been built not by human hands, but by something else entirely. The transmission came as they approached. "Void Wardens, you are expected. Your ship will be escorted to the gathering site. Come armed if it eases your conscience, but know that what awaits you is not battle." The voice was that of a Dark Angel's Supreme Grand Master, carrying the weight of authority and ancient knowledge. The Sensei and his honor guard transferred to their Thunderhawk, descending toward the 3rd planet's surface, toward a structure that his sensors insisted was impossible. A fortress, preserved intact despite the devastation that had consumed everything else in the system. A fortress whose architectural style matched nothing in Imperial records, but everything in the Sensei's oldest memories. This was a facility from the height of the Great Crusade, from the days before the Heresy, from the age when the Lost Legions had still existed. They landed in a courtyard that had once held thousands of warriors. Now it held only a few dozen figures, but each one represented power that could shape the fate of worlds. Supreme Grand Master Azrael of the Dark Angels, his face weathered by secrets and the burden of maintaining them. Grand Master Voldus of the Grey Knights, psychic power radiating from him like heat from a forge. Tribune Maldivar Coquin of the Adeptus Custodes, golden armor reflecting light that seemed to come from no source. And others, representatives of forces so secretive that their mere presence confirmed this was no ordinary gathering. They stood in a hall whose walls were carved with names, thousands of names, Tens of thousands. And the Sensei recognized them with a shock that nearly drove him to his knees. These were the names of the lost legions. Every warrior who had ever worn their colors. Every battle brother who had died in the Emperor's service. Every commander, every sergeant, every neophyte who had been erased from official history. This was a memorial. A remembrance. A testament to existence maintained in defiance of the Emperor's edict. Azrael stepped forward, his expression carrying something the Sensei had never expected to see from a Dark Angel's master: regret. "We have maintained this place for 10,000 years, he said quietly. "It is our shame and our duty. We were there when your legions fell. We followed Lemon Russ and the Emperor's command. We did what we were ordered to do, and we have carried the weight of that obedience ever since." The Sensei found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. Why? Why preserve this? Why remember what the Emperor commanded be forgotten? Tribune Colquhoun answered, his voice carrying the absolute authority of one who spoke for the master of mankind. Because the Emperor is not infallible. Because even gods make mistakes. And because what was done to the Second and 11th Legions was not justice, but necessity born of fear. Fear that the truth you discovered would undermine everything he was building. The custodian moved to stand before a specific wall, where two names were carved larger than all the others. Names the Sensei had not spoken aloud in 10,000 years. His Primarch's name, and the name of the 11th's Gene Father. They found evidence of the previous human empire's fall, Colquhoun continued. Not just that it fell, but how. They discovered that humanity had attempted apotheosis before, had succeeded, had created god emperors who ruled with absolute power and absolute certainty. And they discovered what those god emperors had become, what they had done to humanity in their quest for perfection. Grandmaster Voldus spoke then, his psychic voice resonating on levels beyond mere sound. They became like the entities we now call the Chaos Gods, not chaos-tainted, but similar in function. Beings of such power that their mere existence warped reality around them. And in their certainty, in their absolute conviction, that they knew what was best for humanity, they reshaped it. Forced evolution, mandatory genetic manipulation, the eradication of deviation, until humanity was no longer human, but something else, something perfect according to their vision, something that lasted perhaps 1,000 years before it consumed itself in a war of competing perfections. The Sensei felt the truth of it settling over him like a shroud. This was what his Primarch had discovered. This was the knowledge that had led to their destruction. Not heresy, not corruption, not even simple doubt, but evidence that the Emperor's path, his absolute certainty, his drive toward human perfection and unity, was the same path that had destroyed humanity before. The Emperor knew, Azrael said, and there was infinite sadness in his voice, had always known. But he believed he would succeed where the previous god emperors had failed. Believed his will was strong enough, his vision clear enough, his purpose pure enough to avoid their fate. And when your Primarchs presented evidence suggesting otherwise, he had two choices: admit doubt and risk everything unraveling, or eliminate those who questioned and continue forward with absolute certainty. Takeda spoke for the first time since entering the hall, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were learning. So he chose certainty, chose to kill us rather than acknowledge the possibility of failure. And for 10,000 years, the Imperium has followed that choice. Absolute faith, absolute obedience. No questions, no doubt, no deviation from the Emperor's vision, even as that vision leads us toward the same extinction that claimed humanity before. Tribune Colquhoun nodded slowly. The Emperor sits on the golden throne, his physical form destroyed by the same certainty that led to the heresy. Half his sons fell to chaos because he refused to explain his purpose, refused to share his doubts, refused to admit that even he might not have all the answers. And the Imperium. He built fragments more each day under the weight of dogma and unquestioning faith in a plan that may be fundamentally flawed. The custodian turned to face the Sensei directly, golden armor gleaming in the strange light. You survived because you were not meant to survive. You endured because you refused to accept erasure. You served because despite everything, you still believe in humanity's future, even if you doubt the Emperor's method of achieving it. And that is why you are here. That is why we have gathered. Grandmaster Voldas stepped forward, psychic energy coalescing around him in patterns that suggested vast forces moving just beyond perception. Roboute Guilliman knows what you are. He has chosen to accept you because he too has begun to question, has begun to see the flaws in his father's design. But he cannot speak openly against the Imperial creed without tearing the Imperium apart, cannot admit doubt without undermining the very faith that holds a billion worlds together. Asriel's voice carried grim determination. But we can. We few, gathered here in secret, maintaining knowledge that was supposed to be destroyed. We represent forces that predate the current Imperial structure. The custodians who served the Emperor before the Imperium existed. The Grey Knights who know truths about chaos that would drive normal humans mad. The Dark Angels who have maintained our own secrets for so long that we have become experts in the art of necessary deception. And now the Lost Legions who carry in their very existence proof that the Emperor's certainty can be wrong. The Sensei looked around at the gathered representatives, understanding finally crystallizing. You want us to be a check, a balance, a force that can question without being dismissed as heretical. Because we have survived despite being erased. Because we have served loyally despite being betrayed. Because we exist as living proof that the Emperor's edicts are not absolute. Tribune Colquhoun inclined his head in acknowledgement. The Imperium needs faith to survive the immediate threats. But it also needs the possibility of evolution, of adaptation, of questioning its foundational assumptions before those assumptions lead it to the same fate that destroyed previous human civilizations. You Lost Legions, scattered and secret, can be that possibility. Operating within the system, but not bound by its dogma. Loyal to humanity's survival, but not to any particular methodology. Free to act, to question, to explore alternatives that the official Imperium cannot consider without risking its cohesion. It was a responsibility larger than any the Sensei had contemplated. Not just survival, not just service, but becoming guardians of an alternative. Keepers of the heretical possibility that the Emperor might be wrong, that his plan might need alteration, that absolute certainty might be humanity's greatest threat rather than its salvation. And it was dangerous beyond measure, because the moment they truly questioned, truly challenged, truly presented an alternative to the Emperor's vision, they would become exactly what they had been accused of being 10,000 years ago. Threats to the Imperium's unity. Sources of doubt that could fracture the faith holding everything together. But looking around at the memorial walls, at the names of his fallen brothers, carved in defiance of erasure, the Sensei understood that this had always been their purpose. Not to be forgotten, but to be a memory. Not to be erased, but to be a reminder. Not to disappear, but to exist as living proof that even the Emperor could make mistakes, and that humanity could survive acknowledging those mistakes without falling into chaos. We accept, the Sensei said, and felt the weight of the decision settling on shoulders that had carried burdens for 13,000 years. We will be what we have always been. The forgotten children, serving from the shadows. But now we serve with purpose beyond mere survival. We serve as the possibility of something different. The path not taken, the questions not asked. The doubt that prevents certainty from becoming extinction. Asriel placed his hand over his heart in the ancient gesture of sworn brotherhood. Then let this hall be witness. The Lost Legions are remembered. Their service is acknowledged, and their purpose is renewed. Not as warriors alone, but as guardians of humanity's capacity to change, to question, to be something other than what it was decreed to be. As they prepared to depart, the Sensei paused before the wall bearing his Primarch's name. He placed his hand against the carved letters, feeling the stone worn smooth by 10,000 years of similar touches from others who had come to this place. Others who had refused to forget. Others who had maintained the memory even when memory was forbidden. And in that moment, With his hand on his father's name, the sensei felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in all the long centuries since the Purge. Not forgiveness for what had been done, but acceptance of what it had made him. The Emperor had tried to erase them, and in doing so had created something he had not anticipated. Warriors who could serve without needing recognition. Leaders who could guide without needing acknowledgement. Teachers who could shape the future without needing to be remembered in it. They were the sensei, the masters without students who could claim them. The forgotten children whose forgetting had become their strength. And now, finally, they had a purpose worthy of their survival. Not just to fight, but to remember. Not just to serve, but to question. Not just to endure, but to ensure that humanity never became so certain of its path that it could not change course when extinction loomed. The Void Wardens deployed to the Nachman Gauntlet 6 weeks after the gathering, their battle barge emerging from the warp into a war zone that had consumed entire systems. Here, where the Great Rift tore reality itself into fragments, the Imperium struggled to maintain a corridor through which supplies and reinforcements could flow between the divided halves of their empire. It was brutal, thankless work, fighting enemies that reformed as quickly as they were destroyed, holding positions that meant nothing except as waypoints on a map that shifted with every warp storm. It was exactly the kind of war the Lost Legions had been fighting for 10,000 years. The kind where glory was measured in survival rather than victory, where success meant simply lasting another day. The sensei stood on the bridge of the Eternal Witness, watching fleet formations maneuver through void space corrupted by warp intrusion. His tactical display showed 17 different battle groups coordinating across a front that spanned 3-star systems. Ultramarines held the northern approaches. Blood Angels defended the core worlds. Imperial Guard regiments by the hundreds of thousands manned defensive positions on every inhabited planet. And moving between them, filling gaps, reinforcing weak points, appearing wherever the fighting was hardest, were the Void Wardens. They fought with a precision that came from experience spanning epochs. Every maneuver was executed perfectly. Every tactical decision was sound. Every engagement ended with objectives achieved and casualties minimized. Other chapters noticed. Commanders requested their presence. After action reports praised their effectiveness. The Void Wardens were becoming exactly what Guilliman had sanctioned them to be. A chapter beyond reproach, loyal and effective, their questionable origins forgotten in the face of their undeniable results. But in the quiet moments between battles, when the bridge crew cycled through rest shifts and the ship ran on minimal staff, the sensei allowed himself to remember. He thought about his Primarch, whose name he still carried carved into his heart, even if he could never speak it aloud. He thought about the choice his Gene Father had made, to question rather than accept, to seek truth rather than certainty, to risk everything rather than serve a vision he believed was flawed. It had cost them everything. Their legion, their identity, their place in history. But standing here now, commanding warriors who had survived the impossible, the sensei understood that perhaps the cost had purchased something valuable: freedom from the weight of certainty, liberty to doubt, to question, to explore alternatives without being bound by dogma or expectation. They had been erased from the Imperium's official history, but that erasure meant they existed outside the Imperium's official constraints. They could think thoughts that others could not consider, could explore possibilities that others had to reject, could serve the Emperor's ultimate goal of human survival while questioning whether his specific methodology was the only path toward that goal. Takeda found him there in the quiet hours, standing before the viewing port as he so often did. His old friend and fellow survivor said nothing at first, simply standing beside him in comfortable silence that came from centuries of shared experience. Finally, Takeda spoke, his voice carrying the weight of philosophical consideration. "Do you think he knows?" The Emperor, sitting on his throne, barely alive, burning through 1,000 psychers a day to maintain the Astronomicon. "Do you think he remembers us? Regrets what he did?" The sensei considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think he knows, he said slowly. The Emperor's not dead, merely transformed. His consciousness spans the galaxy, touching every light of the Astronomicon, every thought of faith directed toward him. He must feel us, these anomalies in his grand design. These survivors who should not exist. He paused, watching a patrol group execute a perfect sweep pattern through an asteroid field. As for regret, I do not know if beings like him experience regret as we understand it. But I believe he understands now, in ways he perhaps did not 10,000 years ago, that certainty can be its own kind of blindness. That eliminating those who question might preserve short-term unity, but sacrifice long-term adaptability. Takeda nodded thoughtfully. The Imperium is dying. Not quickly, but by degrees. Every year there are fewer worlds, fewer resources, more enemies. The faith that holds it together grows more desperate and more rigid. If something does not change, if some capacity for evolution does not emerge, humanity will follow the same path as the previous empire. Will crystallize into perfection and then shatter under the weight of its own inflexibility. It was the truth they had learned in the secret hall, the knowledge that made them both necessary and dangerous. Humanity needed faith to survive the immediate crisis, but it also needed the capacity to change, to adapt, to question its foundational assumptions before those assumptions became the chains that dragged it into extinction. And the lost legions, existing in the space between official dogma and outright heresy, could be that capacity. Not openly, not obviously, but through small actions accumulated across centuries. A tactical innovation that challenged Codex doctrine. A philosophical question raised in the right moment. A reminder, subtle but persistent, that the Emperor's plan was not scripture but strategy, and strategy could be adapted when circumstances changed. The Vox crackled with an urgent transmission. Orc forces had broken through the Imperial line in the southern sector. 3 regiments of guard were cut off, facing annihilation. The nearest reinforcements were hours away. The Void Wardens were being requested to respond. The Sensei looked at his tactical display, calculating vectors and probabilities with enhanced cognition that made the mathematics almost instinctive. They could reach the position in time, but it would expose their fleet to counterattack. Standard doctrine said to maintain position, preserve forces, accept the loss of the guard regiments as unavoidable. But the Sensei had not survived 13,000 years by following standard doctrine. All ships, he ordered, prepare for emergency translation. We moved to assist immediately. The bridge crew responded with practiced efficiency, but the Sensei caught Takeda's knowing look. This was what they did. What they had always done. Made the choices that doctrine said were unwise, took the risks that pragmatism said were unjustified, saved the lives that cold calculation said were expendable. Because they remembered being expendable themselves. Remembered being the soldiers that doctrine said should be erased, that pragmatism said were too dangerous to preserve, that cold calculation said were worth less than the stability their elimination would provide. The eternal witness tore back into real space above a world whose name the Sensei would forget within a week, as he had forgotten 1,000 such names. But he would remember the faces of the guard soldiers they pulled from the collapsing defensive line. Would remember their expressions of disbelief that Space Marines had come for them, that they had not been abandoned, that their lives mattered enough for warriors in sacred armor to risk themselves. Those faces were why the lost legions endured. Not for glory or recognition, not for vindication or restoration, but for the simple act of ensuring that humanity survived to see another dawn. That individual humans whose names would never be recorded in any history, whose existence meant nothing to the grand strategic situation, were still worth saving. It was perhaps the most fundamental rejection of the thinking that had destroyed the previous human empire. That perfect vision which had categorized humans by their utility, by their genetic potential, by their capacity to contribute to an ideal future. That certainty which had decided that some lives mattered and others did not, that some bloodlines were worthy of preservation and others were better erased. The Sensei and his lost legions existed as living proof that the erased could survive, that the unwanted could prove valuable, that those deemed unworthy of remembrance could still serve purposes beyond what their creators had imagined. 3 months later, the Sensei received a private communication on an encrypted channel that took his system several minutes to decode. When the message finally resolved, it was short, unsigned, but unmistakable in its origin. Only one being in the Imperium could access encryption this sophisticated, could bypass security protocols this comprehensive, could send a message directly to a ship lost in the vastness of the galaxy. The message read simply, "I see you. I have always seen you. Continue." The Sensei stared at the words for a long time, feeling something shift in his chest. The Emperor knew, had always known, had watched his lost sons survive and serve and endure through all the long millennia of erasure, and he was allowing it, perhaps even approving it, perhaps understanding, finally, that the children he had tried to eliminate had become something more valuable than the certainty he had tried to preserve. The Sensei deleted the message, erasing even the possibility of its existence from his ship's systems. Some knowledge was too dangerous to preserve, even in the most secure archives. But he carried the words in his memory, carved into the same space where his Primarch's name resided, where the faces of his lost Legion brothers were preserved against 10,000 years of erosion. He thought about the journey that had brought him here. From the bright days of the Great Crusade, when the galaxy seemed conquerable and the future certain. Through the horror of the Purge, when everything he knew was destroyed, and he learned that even the Emperor's love had limits. Across 10 millennia of hiding and serving and fighting wars that no one would remember he had fought. To this moment, standing on the bridge of a ship bearing a false chapter's colors, commanding warriors whose true identities could never be spoken, serving an Imperium that had tried to kill them, but now tacitly acknowledged their necessity. It was not redemption. The lost legions would never be officially restored, never be remembered in the great halls, never have their names carved on monuments or their deeds recorded in the histories. But perhaps redemption was not what mattered. Perhaps what mattered was simply continuing. Serving not for recognition, but for purpose. Fighting not for glory, but for survival. Existing not to be remembered, but to ensure that others could live to remember their own stories. In the end, the Sensei understood they had become exactly what the galaxy needed. Not heroes standing in the light, but guardians working in shadow. Not warriors seeking vindication, but soldiers who had transcended the need for vindication. Not the Emperor's lost children seeking to return home, but the Emperor's forgotten servants who had found a home in service itself. They were the Sensei, the masters without disciples who could name them. The teachers whose lessons were written in survival rather than doctrine. The warriors whose greatest victory was not any single battle, but the simple fact of their continued existence across an age of the galaxy that should have destroyed them 1,000 times over. And as the eternal witness prepared to translate to the next war zone, the next desperate battle, the next moment where the difference between extinction and survival would be measured in the actions of warriors whose names no one would record, the Sensei felt something close to peace. Not the peace of rest or completion, but the peace of purpose understood and accepted. They would continue. Generation after generation of lost Legion survivors, each one carrying the memory of what had been erased, each one serving in the shadows of an Imperium that could not acknowledge them. They would be the doubt in the certainty, the question in the dogma, the memory that even gods could be wrong and that humanity could survive admitting it. They would be the forgotten children who refused to be forgotten, not through defiance, but through the simple act of continuing to serve, continuing to fight, continuing to exist in defiance of erasure. And perhaps, in some distant future when the Imperium had evolved beyond its current rigid faith, when humanity had learned to question without fragmenting and to adapt without losing cohesion, the lost legions would finally be able to step fully into the light, would be able to speak their true names and claim their true heritage, would be able to tell the story of how they survived 10,000 years of erasure and emerged not bitter but strengthened, not vengeful but wiser, not demanding recognition but offering service. But until that day, they would walk in shadow. They would fight under borrowed names. They would serve an emperor who had tried to kill them and an Imperium that did not know they existed. Because that was what warriors did. That was what the Lost Legions had been created for, even if neither they nor their creator had understood it at the time. Not to be perfect soldiers executing a perfect plan toward a certain victory, but to be imperfect survivors adapting to impossible circumstances, finding ways to serve even when service was not acknowledged, discovering purposes beyond what they were designed for. They were humanity's capacity for resilience made manifest in transhuman form. They were the proof that erasure was not the same as extinction, that being forgotten was not the same as ceasing to matter, that the unwanted could become the indispensable if they simply refused to stop existing. The Sensei looked out at the stars, at the galaxy that had tried to kill him and failed, at the Imperium he served despite its rejection, at the future that remained uncertain despite all attempts to make it certain. And he smiled, an expression that would have shocked those who thought they knew him, because it carried something that warriors who had survived the impossible understood better than anyone. Hope. Not hope that things would be easy, or that recognition would come, or that the past would be vindicated, but hope that humanity would continue, would adapt, would survive, would find ways forward even when the path seemed blocked, would become something more than what it had been, not through perfect planning, but through imperfect persistence. The Emperor's forgotten children still walked among them, and they would continue walking through whatever wars and ages lay ahead, until either humanity survived to remember them, or disappeared into the darkness that claimed all civilizations eventually. But either way, they would walk, because that was what it meant to be forgotten but not gone, erased but not destroyed, lost but not abandoned. They were the Sensei, and their lesson, taught through 13,000 years of survival, was the simplest and most profound truth that any warrior could learn. That existence itself, maintained through impossible odds and against absolute certainty, was its own form of victory. The only victory that truly mattered in a galaxy where everything else was temporary.